So these are the people, and now the screen is going to go black for a few minutes. That's intentional. It's for the introduction. It'll go back to slides soon. So just to introduce what I'm going to talk about, I study what makes us human, and I do it from a cognitive perspective. You could do it from other perspectives, right? So from a cultural perspective or a social one, but I'm interested in what it is about the human mind that makes us so unique in the animal kingdom. And of course, there are many answers to what is the pinnacle of human cognition, but two answers that feature very high up that list for most people are language and fluid intelligence. And language is on that list of what makes us human because it's unique to our species, and it's also universal across human cultures. And it's the most advanced device that we have for transferring thoughts across minds or doing something like Inception in the movie. Fluid intelligence is our ability to solve novel problems that we haven't seen before. And a central part of that is our ability to modulate our behavior in the service of a goal. So we call that goal-directed behavior. So for example, when you inhibit a reflex, when it's inappropriate in the moment, or where you have multiple conflicting responses or alternative representations and you have to choose one among them, or when you need to hold information in working memory and manipulate it, or when you build a model that explains what happens in your environment and you use it to generate predictions, things like that. And overall, we call these abilities executive function skills, or another name is cognitive control. And our executive function skills are unparalleled in the animal kingdom. And moreover, the brain regions that support them, which I'll talk about soon, are much more developed in humans compared to other animals. And the work I will share with you today links together these two cognitive capacities, language and executive function. And specifically, I'm going to ask what role executive function plays in language processing. And this is the cognitive question. I know that maybe some of you might be interested in maybe a more of an evolutionary perspective. And so if language does rely on executive functions, that could mean that executive functions were an evolutionary precursor to language, or at least they had to co-evolve together jointly with a tight link between them. Now, more generally, maybe if we're trying to explain how the human mind evolved, it would be very useful to know what the human mind is. And so I think relating language and fluid intelligence, which are two maybe human defining characteristics, is a central issue in understanding what our mind is, or maybe how our mind is. So I'm going to talk about whether or not language comprehension relies on executive resources and in what ways. And so I'd like to start with just a brief description of my approach to studying language more broadly. So in my research, I work on formulating a cognitive theory of language, and specifically language comprehension. And if you want to form a cognitive theory of language, the key requirement is that you identify the different mechanisms that are involved in comprehension, sort of the different sub-processes or the different components, and then you specify the role or the function of each of them. And so in other words, you might say that what I'm trying to do is to carve comprehension at its joints. And so the overarching question that sort of defines my research program is, how is linguistic labor divided across distinct cognitive mechanisms? And when I imagine what an answer to this question might look like, I think of two related aspects. So on the one hand, a theory of language should look inward, so to take language and break it apart into its constituent components. And a theory of language should also look outward. So by that, I mean sort of placing or situating language in the broader architecture of the human mind. And today I'll focus on this second part, and specifically I'll be contrasting two kinds of mechanisms. So the first kind of mechanism that I'm going to talk about is special purpose mechanisms that are selectively engaged in language processing, but not in any other cognitive process, as far as we can tell, all these language specific mechanisms. So you can think of these mechanisms as related to our specific knowledge about language. So the meanings of words and the rules for combining these words into larger meanings, and what sentence structures are available to us, or what forms are available to us to convey these meanings, and so on. The second kind of mechanisms are mechanisms that are recruited by a very broad range of domains and tasks. So these mechanisms also engage in comprehension, but they also do many other things. And so I refer to them as domain general. And these are the executive functions I mentioned before, things like working memory, cognitive control, inhibition, prediction, and so on. And to study how each of these mechanisms contributes to how we understand language, I take a cognitive neuroscience approach. So let me describe this. Overall, what I do is I study the neural basis of language, so how language happens in the brain using functional MRI or fMRI in order to inform and constrain theories of how language happens in the mind. And so to understand this approach, let's just start by looking at the brain of one individual during comprehension. So I'm going to show you a brief sort of video clip that will show you what regions in this person's brain light up when this person is reading relative to when they're just staring at a blank screen, what we call fixation. And I'm not going to show the visual cortex here in the back just because I want us to focus on brain regions that are engaged in higher level cognitive processes. And so this is what it looks like once the person starts reading. And stronger colors sort of denote stronger activity. And I'm showing here how it changes over time. All right. And so you see that there is a huge swath of regions shown here in yellow, huge swaths of cortex that are activated during reading. And so one interesting question is, well, how do we partition this huge swath, right, into distinct regions? So do different aspects of comprehension or different sub-processes of comprehension recruit different sets of regions? And it turns out that that is indeed the case. So some regions here within this yellow cortex or yellow swaths that I'm showing here in red are language specific. They seem to respond just for language. I'll show you some data in a second. I call them core language regions, or overall, I call this the core language network. And there are other regions that I show here in blue that are domain general, and they form part of what I call, well, other people call that as well, the multiple demand network. All right, and now this is, of course, just the brain of one person. So I'm going to show you these networks in other brains as well. So for example, here's the brain of one individual, and in red, you see the core language regions in that brain. Now, what I'm going to show you here, all the brains are going to have the same shape because they are all template brains or a standard brain. But on that standard brain, I'm going to project the specific activations of different people. So here are the regions in 4 other people. You can see that the overall topography is kind of the same, even though the particular locations of where these regions are not precisely overlapping, and that's going to matter a lot a few minutes down the line. And overall, what you can see is that sort of everyone has their language regions or a language region somewhere within this broad red big neighborhood that I'm showing on the bottom. Where exactly each of our language regions lie differs within this broad neighborhood. And then you can also look at this other broad neighborhood, more towards the front of the temporal lobe. And each one of us, virtually everyone, has a language region somewhere within this neighborhood, but where exactly, that varies. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. And here are the same 4 people and their multiple demand regions, whereas the language regions are mostly on the left. Multiple demand regions, I'll call them MD for short. They're on both hemispheres. And again, at the bottom, I show these broad neighborhoods where each of us has MD regions somewhere within each of these broad neighborhoods. All right. So I claim that these are 2 different kinds of regions, right? But I haven't shown you any data. So first, I just want to convince you that these are really 2 distinct kinds of regions that do different things. And so what I'm going to show you now is some fMRI data. And first, I'm going to show you the behavior or the response of the language subregions of Broca's area. So Broca's area is sort of a very famous brain area that you read about in every introduction to psychology book. And those books claim that it's a language region. It's actually not a language region. It's very heterogeneous, but there is a subpart in it that does language. And I'm going to show you how it responds to different tasks. So on the y-axis, I'm going to show you the % signal change or increase in activity that we record with fMRI, where 0 doesn't mean 0 activity. The brain is not dead. 0 means the same level of activity as when you're just staring at a blank screen doing nothing. And so first, you can give people language tasks, right? You can let them read sentences or gibberish. And this is indeed a language region. It responds more when you read sentences than when you read gibberish. It likes language. You can also do it auditorily. It doesn't have to be in reading. So you can have people listening to intact speech or to speech that has been auditorily degraded. So it sounds something like this. This is auditorily degraded speech. Very hard to understand what's happening. So again, this region really likes intact speech, responds way less to degraded speech. And then you could start doing all of these non-linguistic tasks to see if this region just likes language or does other things. So you can have people listen to music, either intact or scrambled, and this region couldn't care less. It's as active as where you're staring when you're staring at a blank screen. You can give people arithmetic exercises that could be easier or harder. This region doesn't care at all. You can give them working memory tasks where they have to, for example, keep a set of spatial locations on the screen, and it could be easier or harder. You can also do verbal working memory where people have to keep in mind digit words, so words like 2, 3, 5. And And then you can do other tasks that are related to executive function, not just working memory. So for example, tasks of inhibition. So in these tasks on each trial, you have sort of two responses and you need to inhibit one of them and choose the one that's appropriate, and that's the conflict. You can also do this in the verbal domain, doesn't matter. Maybe the most famous inhibition task is Stroop. So if you haven't heard of Stroop, in the Stroop task, you see a color word, like the word blue, but it's painted, the font has a different color, like the color red. And your task is to say what color is, or what the font is colored as. So if I see the word blue colored in red, I should say red, and that's very hard because you just want to read the word blue. So that's a task of inhibition. And in control trials, the word blue is painted in blue, and in conflict trials, the word blue is painted in red or green or whatever. In all of these cases, this brain region really doesn't care. Responses are basically at baseline. If they are above baseline, they are never more than reading gibberish. You can have people watching a silent movie where moments in the movie engage inferences about the mental states of the characters, so theory of mind or social cognition. Other moments of the movie depict physical pain of those characters. You can also have people just physically observe movies of physical actions. Either they observe videos of people making physical actions, or they have to imitate those actions. Again, very low responses, not more than reading gibberish. And the same happens if you do logic puzzles, if you do gesture, if you do basically any other thing that people have tried. Now, there is another subregion in Broca's area, and that region is part of that other network that I mentioned, the multiple demand network. Sorry about these rectangles. I'm going to try making them disappear. So what happens in this region is a very different response profile. So the first thing to notice is that this region responds more to gibberish than to sentences. And overall, this is consistent with the overall response pattern of this region. This region responds more whenever something is harder. And reading gibberish is not very natural. Reading sentences comes very naturally to us. So this region increases its response when you're doing the hardest or the harder task of reading gibberish. And then in all those other tasks that were arithmetic and working memory and inhibition, it shows very strong responses. And not only that, it responds more strongly when you do the harder versions of these tasks. Those are the bars on the right. And it responds more weakly when you do the easier versions of the task. Those are the bars on the left. And so very different response profile than what we see in the language subregion. This is not just true of these subregions of Broca, it's true more generally. If you're interested, we published a review paper that's called Broca's Area is Not a Natural Kind, talking about this division. But now I'm going to show you the average of all of the other core language regions. And so I'm slowly going to change this plot from left to right. And I'm going to do this just so you see that it basically is the same pattern. And so this is what happens. Basically the same across all of the language regions. And I'll do it for the MD, basically the same across all of the MD regions. All right. So I'm going to summarize what we briefly know about this distinction between these two systems or two networks, and hopefully I've convinced you that they're distinct. So the first thing is that they have task-based response profiles that are very different, right? They just respond very differently to a whole range of tasks, suggesting that they do different things, right? They carry out different computations. We also have a double dissociation in neuropsychology or in patient studies. So on the one hand, we have cases of people with global aphasia that happens after stroke. So these are cases where people have basically no language abilities left or almost no language abilities left. And in some of them, the rest of cognition seems perfectly intact. So they can do arithmetic. Some of them can drive and play chess and manage the family finances, things that really require goal-directed behavior. And on the other hand, we have cases like, for example, language savants who have very impaired executive function and IQ. So for example, one of them couldn't take care of himself, but he could translate and communicate in 15 languages. So it's possible to impair one of these capacities, language or executive function, without the other. We also see that signals are synchronized within each system, but not across. So let me explain how we measure this. So you can have people lying in the fMRI scanner and just tell them to close their eyes and let their mind wander. And during those 5-10 minutes, you just measure how activity goes up and down in each brain region, right? And there are just fluctuations in the activity level or fluctuations in the signal. And if you take two red regions, two language regions, the signal fluctuations are very synchronized. So those regions increase and decrease their activity together. And if you take two blue regions, two MD or multiple demand regions, you also see that they're very correlated. Their activity in two blue regions goes up and down in a synchronized way. But if you take one blue region and one red region, those time series or those signal fluctuations are not correlated at all. The correlation is zero. So whatever it is that the regions are doing, they're not synchronized with one another. And finally, we have inter-individual differences in response strength. So people differ in how strongly these regions respond. So if you just put them in the scanner and give them a task, some people are what we like to call strong activators. Those are usually the people we want in our experiments because you get very, very strong signals. And other people are weak activators. And it turns out that if you activate one language region very strongly, or more stronger than other people in the population, you're very likely to activate your other language regions also more strongly compared to the rest of the population. But that tells us nothing about how strong of an activator you are for the blue regions, for the MD regions. So knowing that you are a strong language activator tells us nothing about whether you're a strong MD activator and vice versa, which means that brains don't just generally, some people are stronger activators than others. The stronger or weaker activations across people respect this division into two systems. So some people are strong activators of one system, but not the other. All right. So all of these suggest that these really are two distinct systems. And I'm interested in how both of them contribute to comprehension. All right. So some things we know from past work is that the language system, as I've shown you, is selectively recruited by high-level language processing, right? Selectively means it doesn't do other things. And by high level, I mean things that are related to structure and meaning. So not things like just reading letters or just hearing speech. This system cares about both, not articulation, so not moving your articulators to sort of generate the modal programs to communicate. It's sensitive both to form, or the structure of words and sentences, and the meanings of words and phrases and sentences. There's a causal link to language, as I mentioned. So if you get damage to these regions, your language ability is impaired. And we think, this is very much an ongoing area of investigation, that what recruits these regions, what makes them active, is mostly composition. So taking meanings and putting them together, or forming a structure out of words. So this is sort of how semantically combinable the different words are, how we can put them together in terms of meaning. What about the multiple demand regions? They are recruited by cognitive effort, so by how difficult something is across many stimuli and tasks, as I've shown you. They're related to attention, working memory, cognitive control, hierarchical processing, so building larger structures out of smaller structures, prediction. There's a causal link to IQ. So the bigger the damage is to these regions specifically, the lower the IQ. And in accordance with the general profile that they get more active when something is more difficult, there are many, many studies that report that these regions are recruited when language comprehension is hard. So for example, when sentences have more complex structures, or when words or phrases are ambiguous, or when we see words that are very infrequent that we don't hear a lot, or we see sentence structures that are very infrequent. In all of these cases, there are 2 decades of fMRI study, dozens of studies that report that you see these MD regions being active. And this is just a partial list to show you that from 1996, basically until our day, people have reported this. All right. This is also consistent with behavioral evidence that we have for the relationship between executive function and comprehension. So for example, individual differences tend to co-vary in executive function and language. There are some studies that claim that people with better language abilities also have better executive functions. You also have experiments that use dual tasks where you have to do 2 things simultaneously. And if you give people a non-language task that taxes their working memory, it interferes with their language processing. And that suggests that those 2 things share resources, right? They sort of tap into the same mechanism, because doing one interferes with your ability to do the other. And also, if you deploy executive function, if you use it in some non-linguistic task right now, it transfers to language processing on the next trial or even following training. So let's say I'm giving you this troop task now. So I'm showing you this word blue that is colored in red, and you have to resist the urge to read blue and you need to stay red. That deploys your executive function. If on the next trial I give you a language task, you're going to be better at it. So using executive function now makes you better at language later. This is also consistent with theory, psycholinguistic theory. So when we try to explain why language processing looks the way it does, we explain language processing via reference to things like working memory constraints on how we process the syntax or the structure of sentences. So just an example, if I give you this sentence, I threw out the trash that had been sitting in the kitchen for weeks, and compare it to I threw the trash that had been sitting in the kitchen for weeks out. People prefer the first sentence. And also, when you measure how hard or easy it is for them to read those sentences, the top one is easier. And one explanation is that the word through and out go together in meaning. And in the first sentence, they're close together. In the second sentence, they're really far apart. And so you have to hold the word through in working memory a much longer time until you can combine it with out. And that's our working memory resources are limited. So there's some constraint here. Theories also make reference to ambiguity resolution. So resolving ambiguities and selecting the correct representation. So for example, look at this sentence from a journal of a medical doctor. The patient reports pain starting from his spinach, which goes down to his knee. There are, of course, two meanings. Either the pain goes down to his knee or something else goes down to his knee. And so this is syntactic ambiguity. The structure of the sentence is ambiguous. And there are two different hierarchical structures of the sentence, how these words combine with one another that you need to choose between to interpret the sentence. Theories also talk a lot about inhibiting irrelevant meanings and inhibiting irrelevant syntactic structures. That's very similar to what I said before. So for example, when people read this sentence, they sort of get stuck and it doesn't make sense. And that's because they think the old man is a noun, but actually man is used here as a verb to man something, to occupy it with people. So this means that the group of old people man the boats, exactly like the old build the boats. So in this case, you need to inhibit the irrelevant meaning of man being used as a noun and understand that man is a verb. Also, our theories, or psycholinguistic theories, make a lot of reference to prediction of incoming input. I'll give you examples later. And so all of these are examples of executive functions: working memory, selecting the correct representation, inhibiting what's irrelevant, predicting. These are all executive functions. All right. But I want to claim that all of these evidence for relationship between executive function and language is problematic, and especially the fMRI ones. And so the first reason is that dissociations trump associations. That's generally true in cognitive psychology. Associations are much stronger evidence, and I've shown you in patient studies and in some cases of fMRI that we get very strong dissociations between these different systems. In addition, all of these fMRI studies that I talked about that find increased activity in the multiple demand regions when language is hard rely on group analyses, and I'm going to describe what that is. This method is very, very problematic. So here's the general idea. You scan people's brains as they're doing a task, and now the question is, which brain regions are engaged in your task, right? Your task can be reading sentences or whatever. And you want to see which brain regions are engaged in your task across people. But how do you collapse your neuroimaging data across people, right? Their brains have different sizes and different shapes and different orientations. And so the common solution in group analysis is you take each brain and you stretch it a little bit and you rotate it and you reshape it until all the brains match a common template of what a standard brain should look like. And by standard, I mean a bunch of old white people from Canada. That's our standard template. And so what this allows you to do is to establish anatomical correspondence across the brains. So now they're all anatomically identical or very, very similar. And so now what you can do is to look at each anatomical location in turn, and you can run a statistical test, basically just a t-test, to see whether that particular region is engaged in your task across people. So you establish anatomical correspondence across participants. But this method crucially relies on an implicit assumption, and the assumption is that a given anatomical location corresponds to the same functional unit across participants, or in simple words, if you look at a given anatomical location, it always does the same thing across people. Another way of saying this is that function maps onto anatomy in a consistent way, right? If you look at a particular chunk of anatomy, it always does the same thing across people. But unfortunately, we know from many studies that this assumption is just invalid in brain areas that are engaged in language and other high-level cognitive functions. There are actually a lot of differences, a lot of individual variability in where exactly different processes are implemented. And I've shown you that before. I'll show you it again. So I'm going to show you core language regions. So these are the regions that respond more to sentences than to gibberish. And if you just scan people on reading sentences and reading gibberish and ask where in the brain do we see activity, this is what you see in one brain, this is what you see in 3 other brains. And again, you can see that overall, the topography of these red blobs is the same across brains, but they don't occupy precisely the same territories, right? There are differences. And moreover, this becomes really problematic if now I ask, what regions in the brain respond more to gibberish than to sentences? Those would be the MD regions, right? That respond more when something is harder, and reading gibberish is harder. And what you can see is that if you take a specific anatomical location, for example, shown here in green, in 2 brains, it could respond more to sentences than to gibberish, and it would be a core language region. And in 2 other brains, it would respond more to gibberish than to sentences, show exactly the opposite pattern, and be part of the MD system. And so if you take data from this anatomical location and average it across participants, you just collapse together two very distinct systems. And you can't trust any results you get, because the results you get at the group level will not represent any individual brain. So this is very problematic. I'll also make a small aside here about the importance of foresight. So when I prepared these slides for my dissertation defense, I thought it would be very cute if the first brain and all of its activations would be the brain of my boyfriend. And so that's what I did. And then we broke up, and now he's my ex-boyfriend. And now I'm stuck with his brain on all of my slides, because generating these images is a lot of work. So foresight is crucial. All right. So the problem with group analyses is that there's inter-individual variability, differences between people in how function maps onto anatomy. And so that means that you can't use reverse inference from anatomy back to function. You can't point to a location in the brain and say this location is 2 millimeters to the right and 5 millimeters above the center of the brain, and therefore I know it's a language region. You just can't know that, because it's going to be a language region in some brains and not in others. So that's a problem, and all of my work doesn't rely on group analyses. And if you ever read fMRI studies of language or other cognitive abilities that use this, be very suspicious. The second problem that is very important is that all of these studies that I've shown you study what I call language in the lab rather than sort of language in the wild, what I call. So the idea is that you, in all of these experiments, you cleverly isolate some particular mental functions by using a clever task, instead of broadly sampling the vast space of mental processes that are engaged in everyday comprehension. And more importantly, when you do this, you turn language into problem solving. So often in those studies, you'd see things like you give people a sentence like the grandmother is kissing the daughter or the girl, and you'll have two pictures, grandmother kissing girl, girl kissing grandmother, and you'll have people choose which picture goes with the sentence. We never do this in the real world. Like this is basically turning language into problem solving. So of course you're going to need fluid intelligence. Of course you're going to see MD regions being active when you turn language into an IQ test, because fluid intelligence is implemented in those regions. Now, there have been studies, especially recently, that use more naturalistic paradigms that try to do comprehension that is a little more like in the wild, but all of them rely on group analyses. And so what I introduced into the field of language neuroscience is to both use naturalistic paradigms and avoid group analyses. And I think this gives us a lot of power. People have done that before in other domains, but I introduced this into the domain of language. So I didn't invent this. I just borrowed it from other smarter people. All right. And so what I'm going to show you today, hopefully, is 3 lines of work that test the role of executive function in comprehension. First, I'm going to ask whether multiple demand regions closely track the linguistic input, and I'm going to explain why in a second. Then I'm going to ask whether the MD network engages in prediction specifically. And then I'll ask whether processing difficulty, so the behavioral effects that we can see when processing becomes more difficult, correlates with activity in MD regions. And so for all of these 3 questions, my approach is going to be to first identify or localize the multiple demand and the core language regions, but in each participant individually, based on a signature response to a well-validated task. So I'm going to give people a task, and I'm going to find what regions in their brain look like or behave or respond like language regions, even if those regions don't precisely overlap across individuals. And once I find those regions, then I characterize their activity during passive listening to naturalistic stories. So then people just lie in the scanner and I tell them, here's a 6-minute story, just listen, which is way more naturalistic, right? Engaging your language processing mechanisms in what they were designed to do in the real world, which is just get meaning out of the input. So how do we do this subject-specific functional localization, identifying regions based on their function in a subject-specific way? Well, we just let people read sentences in gibberish, and we find within each of these broad neighborhoods, for each subject specifically, what small parts in these broad neighborhoods respond more to sentences. And then we get those regions that I've shown you before. And so then we can take, for example, this region that is shown in green, and we call this the same region. We call this a functional region of interest, or NFROI. And we treat this as the same region across participants, the same functional unit, even though it doesn't fall exactly in the same place. They're close enough, they fall in the same general neighborhood, so we treat them the same. And similarly, we treat that region as the same across participants, and so on. So here's how the language task looks like when you're actually doing it in the scanner. You just see words pop up on the screen one by one, and you just passively read them. So it looks like this. And then in other cases, you do the same, but it's gibberish, and it looks like this. And you just look for regions that respond more to sentences than to gibberish. And importantly, this generalizes across modalities. So you can do it with, for example, having people listen to sentences or gibberish, and you get the same regions. It generalizes across tasks. So you can read them passively, or you can give people a memory task and ask them, did this word appear in the sentence you just read? Doesn't matter. It's not under-inclusive. It's not over-inclusive. So that means sometimes people say, well, when you take regions that respond more to sentences than to gibberish, you don't get language sounds. You don't get phonology, because regions that care about language sounds would respond similarly to both. It just so happens that we're lucky in this task actually also gives us regions that respond to phonology. And it identifies what we call a natural kind. So a set of regions that really seem to be a natural division in the brain. And one way to see this is, again, you can put people in the scanner, tell them to close their eyes and mind wander, and then you can use a data-driven algorithm to give you back a set of regions that are all synchronized, that all go up and down in their activity. And these are 3 brains. And what you see in black contours are regions that are all synchronized with one another. This is completely data-driven. You just give the algorithm the signal fluctuations when people do whatever it is they do when they mind wander. And the algorithm tells you all the regions in black here are all together, synchronized. What you see in yellow and orange are responses to this task of sentences versus gibberish. So you basically get the same thing. So this task is just a quick and easy way to give you something that is really a natural division within the brain. To get multiple demand regions, we give people a working memory game. So what you're going to see here is a grid of squares, and the locations in that square or in that grid start lighting up in blue. And the task of the participant is just remember what those locations are, hold them in working memory. And then afterwards, you see 2 grids side by side, and you have to say which ones shows colored squares in the locations that you've memorized. So it looks like this. Right, and it's the one on the right. And then you have a harder version where you have to keep track of 8 things and not 4 things, and it looks like this. All right, and I don't know which one it is because I'm really terrible at this, but I think it's the one on the right. And so what we're looking for when we do this task is for regions that respond more to the hard version than the easy version, right? That makes sense because what the system is doing, or a response signature of the system is to respond more to harder, more demanding things. And in some other participants, we give them non-words or gibberish and look for regions that respond more to gibberish than to sentences. Doesn't matter, you get the same regions. It generalizes to many contrasts, or many, we call this something more than something else, or responses in some condition stronger than responses in another condition. We call this a contrast. You can do any contrast of cognitive effort. It can be hard and easy math. It can be hard and easy anything. You get the same regions. And this tool identifies a natural kind. So you can do this same trick of asking an algorithm to give you a set of synchronized regions, and you get these regions. Once I find those regions, then I have people just listen to naturalistic stories, but actually they're deceptively naturalistic. And so what I mean is we took stories and we put inside them, we edited them to have a lot of ambiguous words and structures, a lot of infrequent words, and a lot of complex structures, syntactic structures, sentence structures that are very complex. And the reason we did this is we wanted to make stories that would drive the MD regions wild. We wanted to make stories that are very difficult to process, even though they sound naturalistic. And we did that just because we wanted to give the MD regions sort of the best chance to show themselves as you're comprehending language. And we had to edit the stories because these things just don't happen frequently enough in naturalistic text. If you just take an existing text from a book, right? Infrequent words by definition don't happen frequently. And so I'm going to show you a part of a story and what it looks like. And I'm going to color these phenomena in color as they occur. So this is just a small excerpt from a story.
The huntsman discovered the boar preferred to come out in the middle of the day. So he went to the wood by the well with his good bow to bide his time. Around noontime, the boar, feared by the locals, came out, as slow as a snail, from among the trees, just as the huntsman had predicted.
All right, so I don't know if you heard that. Hopefully you heard that. And so, for example, the huntsman discovered the boar is ambiguous because that could be a sentence in itself, right? The huntsman discovered the boar. The boar is what was discovered, but actually this is the husband discovered that the boar preferred blah, blah, blah. And so here's a bigger part of the story with all of these phenomena highlighted. And again, this is a small part of a 5-6 minute story. And this story behaviorally, if you measure people's processing of the story behaviorally, it really modulates processing difficulties. You can really see how from word to word processing gets easier and harder. Anecdotally, one way to see it is that the people who had to record these stories to make the stimuli had to record them many, many, many times because they would constantly make errors when reading them. That's also just anecdotal evidence that these stories really manipulate processing difficulty. So if MD regions, if these executive function regions care about comprehension, these are the stories that are going to drive them wild. All right, so now that I demonstrated the approach, I can show you, hopefully relatively quickly, how we answer these questions. So the first one is whether MD regions are even listening, closely listening to the stories. And so why is this important? That's important because if you look at the literature, people hypothesize that MD regions do things like, or are engaged, increase their response when search times in the mental lexicon are prolonged. So for example, when you see a low frequency word, it takes you a longer time to find it in your mental dictionary. And so when that search time is longer, people claim that MD regions increase their activity, or during online recovery from an incorrect interpretation. So that's like the old man, the boats that I showed you. Or when you have real-time ambiguity resolution, right? You see a word like bank, and online in real time, you have to decide whether that means the bank of a river or the bank where you put money. And all of these different things, MD regions engage in some online incremental moment-to-moment processes that rely on tight tracking of the input, right? Of closely listening to the story. Because if a region didn't track the incoming language carefully, how could it modulate its response based on these features that change from word to word, right? That vary from moment to moment. But no one has actually tested this assumption explicitly, that these regions are closely listening to the story. And it might not be true during naturalistic comprehension when subjects don't have to do these unnatural and artificial and weird tasks that usually we have them do. And so we wanted to see whether MD regions closely track the linguistic input. All right, so how do you do this? How do you measure whether a region is closely listening to a story? And so here's the overall rationale. If a brain region is not listening to a story, then the incoming or to the incoming language, then when you're listening to a story, the activity in that region would go up and down in a way that's unrelated to the story, right? That region is not listening, it doesn't care about it, activity goes up and down based on something else. But if a region is closely tracking the incoming story, if it's closely listening to what's happening, then the story should influence its activity in a reliable way, right? Fluctuations in activity in that region are going to be reliably influenced by the story. And if activity fluctuations are influenced by the story, they should be similar across different brains of different people who are all listening to the same story. And so the idea is that if we compare the responses of a brain region across individuals, that gives us a proxy of how closely that region is listening to the story, right? Because only if that region is listening to the story, we'll see similar responses across people. If that region is doing something completely random, then that random thing wouldn't be similar across people. And so here's how we do this, using response reliability across people as a proxy for input tracking. We take one brain region, let's say that one in green, and we just extract how activity goes up and down, how the signals get stronger and weaker throughout time, throughout a 5-minute story. And we do this for every subject. And then what we do is we keep one subject aside, the one on the left, and we average the signals from the other participants. That just gets rid of some noise. And the crucial thing is then we correlate this one subject that we left out, their signal fluctuations, with the group average. So we just compute a correlation that's called an intersubject correlation. And we repeat this many times. Every time we leave a different subject out and compare it to the rest of the group. And if those things are similar, that means this region cares about the story. And so I'm going to show you the results now. I'm going to show you the average across language regions and the average across MD regions. That's just for visualization. In the analysis, we actually analyze each region. And the correlation, the story tracking measure, is going to be on the y-axis. So higher means a region is listening to the story more closely. And so we get a very strong correlation for language regions and a way weaker correlation for MD regions. And it's still significantly above chance. So there is some tracking, but it's way, way weaker. And when I saw this, I thought this was a fluke. I said, okay, it's impossible. These stories were edited to be so difficult and to modulate activity in MD regions. It's just a mistake. So we ran this again with the same stories and new subjects, and we replicated it. And then we said, okay, let's just try a different story altogether and new subjects, and we replicated it again. So at this point, I'm pretty sure this is real. And This shows you that if you actually look at the numbers, the tracking explains 4 to 5 times more variance in language regions than in MD regions. So explained variance is correlation squared. And so if you square these numbers, the stories explain 4 to 5 times more variance in the activity of the language network than the MD network, suggesting that the MD network really isn't listening to the story much. It really can't support the processes that people have attributed to it. Now, you might say, okay, then this is not fair because maybe the MD regions really care about difficulty, but what's difficult for you when you're listening to a story is not what's difficult for us when we're listening to a story. So comparing different people is just not fair. And so what we did is we brought people to the scanner twice to listen to the same story twice. And that could be an hour apart, or it could be 6 months apart, it doesn't matter. And then within the same person, we looked at the first time they listened to the story and the second time they listened to the story, and we asked, do the signals look the same? And we get the same pattern. So the signals in the language regions look way more similar to one another than the signals in the MD regions across 2 repetitions of a story in the same individual. All right. And so this suggests that MD regions really cannot support these processes that have been attributed to them, which is a problem. All right. So weaker stimulus tracking compared to core language regions. But as I showed you, there was still tracking in the MD regions of the story above chance, right? It was above 0. So what's happening there? So we started to coming up with specific hypotheses based on specific theories. And one of them is linguistic prediction that many people have attributed to MD regions. We said, okay, maybe if we use a specific hypothesis, we'll find something. So if you read something like the kids went outside too, and I asked you just to think of the next word, different people come up with different things, but one thing many people come up with is play. And that shows you that we're very good at language prediction and we engage in it all the time. And we're very sensitive to how predictable a word is. It's ubiquitous and it's exquisite. So what do I mean by ubiquitous? People predict across different contexts, across different linguistic grain sizes. So people predict sounds, they predict words, they predict chunks of words, they predict sentence structures, and they predict both the form and the meaning. So it's ubiquitous. It's also exquisite. And by that, I mean that we start predicting, another thing is that we start predicting as soon as possible, at least in some contexts. So the minute you start hearing even the first sound of a word, you already predict what that word is going to be. And predictability modulates your reading time, how long it takes you to read a word, across 6 orders of magnitude. So you can measure the probability that a word would occur given the context. And across 6 orders of magnitude of that probability modulates your response times, which means it's exquisite because you don't just know the difference between a frequent word and an infrequent word. Your mind knows the difference and shows a behavioral effect between a very, very infrequent word and a very, very, very infrequent word. So our sensitivity to predictability is exquisite. We predict both linearly based on a word sequence, like in this case, and also hierarchically based on sentence structure. So if you take something like the guest I had invited here arrived, if you just look at the word string I had invited here, arrived should be very surprising because that really doesn't happen a lot after these 4 words. But it's not surprising based on hierarchical prediction because you are parsing a sentence that has an agent or this noun, the guest, and you're still waiting for a verb. And so based on the sentence structure, you know that you're waiting for a verb. And there's a lot of literature linking linguistic prediction as an executive function. So generally when people talk about prediction, they talk about it as a domain general skill. So a skill that occurs across cognition, and it's the same mechanism, the same cognitive resource that is used whenever we predict in vision, in audition, in music, in language, whenever. There are some studies suggesting that executive function might co-vary with linguistic prediction. So for example, kids and older adults have reduced executive function and claims that they also have reduced language processing abilities. And so the hypothesis here is that reduced predictability, so words that are more surprising, should register as increased activity in MD regions. So when something is surprising, you should get more activity. Basically, the rationale is when something is more surprising, it's harder to process. MD regions increase their activity when something is harder. There are 2 sort of accounts for why this would happen. One is the cognitive juice account. So MD regions come to the rescue of the core language regions. When something is surprising, they provide additional resources, additional cognitive juice. Another idea is prediction errors. So the idea here is that MD regions, especially in the prefrontal cortex, especially Broca's area, they compute abstract representations of the context. And in this case, context is just the words that came before. And so based on that, they predict what's going to happen. And if the next word, if the input is unexpected, given the context, you need to revise your model that does the prediction, right? The prediction is based on some model of how language behaves. If you get something surprising, you need to revise your model, and that model revision should register as increased activity. All right, so how do you measure how predictable a word is given the context? We have a measure in psycholinguistics, it's called Surprisal. Surprisal of a word given what's come before. You just take the probability of a word given the context and you take minus log, that doesn't matter. But basically lower probability means higher surprisal, right? A word that has a very low probability of occurring is very surprising. And so you can measure it both linearly and hierarchically. So linearly means just based on a sequence of words. Hierarchically means based on a structure of a sentence. So the probability of a word given the context, in a linear way of measuring surprise, the context is just the 4 previous words. In a hierarchical way, measuring surprise, the context is the partial sentence that you built so far. So if you look at the guest I had invited here arrived, in a linear surprisal, you would compute the probability of seeing arrived, given that you've just read the 4 words I had invited here. To compute hierarchical surprise, you'll compute the probability of seeing arrived, given that you're parsing a sentence and you're still waiting a verb. And so we wanted to ask whether Surprisal, how surprising each word in the story is, predicts fMRI signal fluctuations in MD regions. And so there are machine learning algorithms that can evaluate the surprisal of each word in each story based on a large corpus of text. So you take millions of texts that have billions of words, and you just basically count of all the cases that I see I had invited here, how often is it followed by the word arrived? And so we can just get a number, a measure of how surprising each word is in the stories. And then you can evaluate a brain region's response to a 1 unit increase in surprisal. So basically ask how much does this region increase its activity when surprisal goes up? And we evaluate this, we train this, or we compute this evaluation of how strongly a region responds on a part of the data. And when we evaluate whether it generalizes to a held out part of the data, which is very important. All right, so I'm going to show you here the evaluated increase in response in a brain region across time. Higher here means the brain responds more strongly. And this is sort of when surprisal increases by 1 arbitrary unit. And in language regions, the response to linear surprisal is very robust. So if you get an increase in surprisal based on the previous sequence of words, you get a strong reaction. The core language regions increase their responses. You also get a very strong response to hierarchical surprisal when something is surprising based on the structure so far. And when you look at the held out data to see whether the model generalizes, these effects explain 37% of the explainable variance of what we can hope to explain in the signal. In MDA regions, we get no effect for linear surprisal. When words are surprising given the previous sequence of words, these MD regions don't increase their activity. They appear to increase their activity to hierarchical surprisal, but this explains no variance in the held out data, which means that this just reflects overfitting to the subset of the data that we used to evaluate this function. So when you take this function and you see whether you can predict the held out data, you can't. And so MD regions really don't respond to surprisal at all. And so for people who are interested in Broca's area, this finding also holds specifically for the MD region in Broca's area. So that region also doesn't care about hierarchical surprisal or linear surprisal. And by the way, this also argues against the idea that we have a general processor of hierarchical structure that is shared between language and other domains. That's another very common theory, that you have a part of your mind and brain that cares about building hierarchical structures across all domains. Doesn't seem to be the case. Language regions build hierarchical structures for language. MD regions do it for other cases. I'll also mention that now we have a study where we use a measure of working memory load. So how much each word in the story taxes your working memory, basically how far it is in the sentence from other words that you need to combine it with. And that also predicts activity fluctuations in the language regions, but not the MD regions. So does the MD network engage in linguistic prediction? No, both linear and hierarchical prediction, we see them in core language regions. What about behavioral effects of processing difficulty? We wanted a theory neutral measure beyond predictability and working memory, because any theory only captures a fraction of the variation in behavior, in how behaviorally difficult it is to process different words. So your theoretical variables are only as good as your theory. And so a theory neutral measure is just reading times, how long it takes you to read every word in the sentence. That appears to track comprehension difficulty. In fact, we believe so strongly that they track comprehension difficulty that we evaluate all of our psycholinguistic theories based on reading times. Now, of course, how long it takes you to read a word is sensitive to many non-linguistic variables, like whether you're paying attention, perceptual processing, motor control of your eyes, the task that you're doing. But still, we assume that they reliably track language difficulty or linguistic processing difficulty. And so what we did here is we compared neuroimaging data with behavioral data. So for fMRI, we measured the signal fluctuations during those 6-minute stories. We had 30 people, and they listened to the stories auditorily. Behaviorally, we had self-paced reading time. So what happens here is you see a word on the screen, and when you're done reading that word, you press the spacebar and you see the next word. And you just do this, pressing the spacebar word after word until you read the whole story. And we measure how long it takes you to press the spacebar for every word. And if it takes you a longer time, that word is harder to process. And we had many people, and they read it, so it was visual. We also tracked their eyes. So as they were reading, other participants were reading full sentences on the screen, and we track how long their eyes land on each word, which is more naturalistic than just pressing a space bar. And this was visual as well. And what we do is that these were separate samples. So the behavioral sample of people, those were different people than the fMRI people. And within each sample, we averaged the data. So we averaged the signal fluctuations across the people in the fMRI, and we averaged the self-paced reading times in the behavioral data set. And the reason is that this should wash out things like attention fluctuations, perceptual and motor processes, and task strategies, because all these things are unlikely to co-vary across participants. And so we average them out. And so any covariation that we see between brain and behavior likely reflects just language, or mostly language. And so then we just correlate how strongly or how slowly each word takes you to read with how strong the activity in the brain is. And so I'm going to show you the correlation between brain and behavior. In language regions, we get a correlation of about 0.1. These are confidence intervals. It seems pretty low, but correlations between behavior and brain are often extremely low. And the noise ceiling in fMRI, if you just sort of put the same person in the scanner twice and compare the activity across those 2 times, or if you compare one person to other people, the ceiling is 0.4. So we don't compare this 0.1 to 1. We can't hope to get to a correlation of 1. We can hope to get to a correlation of 0.4. Crucially, in MD regions in both the left and right hemisphere, we get basically 0. So activity in the brain in the MD regions doesn't correlate with behavioral measures of difficulty. It's not the case that words that are harder to read are also engage the MD system more. They engage the language system more. And again, this also holds specifically for the MD subregions in Broca's area. So does processing difficulty correlate with MD activity? No. Difficulty correlates with activity in core language regions. So this all converges on the view that executive functions really play no role in naturalistic language comprehension. So why did all this past work, 20 years of fMRI research, find that MD regions engage in comprehension? So to look at this, we did a meta-analysis of 30 experiments from a decade in N. Fedorenko's lab. We had almost 500 subjects. Some of them come back to twice or 3 times. So we have almost 700 visits to the fMRI scanner. Almost 60% of these experiments had active tasks, and 40% had passive, where you just passively read sentences or passively listen to sentences. We had different tasks like reading a sentence and then having a memory probe. Did this word appear in a sentence? Or sentence picture matching, so the sentence with the 2 pictures, and you have to say which picture goes with the sentence. Or meaning similarity, reading 2 sentences, saying how similar they are, answering comprehension questions. Most of the tasks were visual. There was a small subset where you listened rather than read. And 60% had sentences. 20% of the experiments just had lists of unconnected words, where you just see how people process individual words. 20% had both. And all sentences were well formed. There were no violation to the structure of the sentences. And what we did is we identified MD regions and core language regions individually in each participant and looked at how they respond to these tasks. All right, so the first thing is comparing activity to lists of unconnected words versus sentences. And the question is whether we're going to see stronger response to more structured and meaningful language. If a region really supports the core computation of comprehensions or core computations of comprehension, it should support more to sentences than to words, right? Because sentences have structured and more meaningful language. And so each experiment of the 30 is going to have a different color, and that's just for our purposes of visualization. The colors don't matter. V means visual, A means auditory. Again, it doesn't matter for us. So MD regions in the left hemisphere, Again, I'm going to show you the percent signal change, where 0 is you're just staring at a blank screen. First, I'll show you the responses to lists of unconnected words. This is the bar for one experiment. So this is the average response across MD regions, across participants for that experiment. These are the other experiments, and this is the average in a confidence interval. So you see responses above 0, above baseline, to sentences and to words. Both of them are significantly above 0, and they're as similar to one another. So MD regions don't respond more to sentences than to lists of unconnected words. That already suggests that they can't support the core computations of comprehension, right? They can't support syntactic parsing, because if this means just building the structure of a sentence, because if they supported it, they would increase their activity when you need to do that in sentences compared when you don't need to do that in lists of words. They can't support semantic composition. We see the same in the right hemisphere. There it's even worse. They respond above baseline to both sentences and words, but they respond even more to words than to sentences. You can contrast that with the core language network, where you get a response to word lists and also response to sentences, but critically, sentences elicit a stronger response, right? This horizontal line here is bigger than it is, or higher than it is here. All right, then the critical, most interesting thing perhaps is experiments that had a task versus experiments with passive reading. Do we see strong engagement regardless of task, right? If a region supports the core computations of comprehension, it shouldn't matter whether you're doing an artificial task or not. Here, the no tasks are in red and orange, and the tasks are in green and blue. In the left hemisphere, MD network of executive functions, when there is a task, you see a strong response. When there is no task, you see 0. No different than when you're just staring at a blank screen, no different than the fixation baseline, and stronger response to task than to no task. So again, when you passively comprehend sentences, the activity in the MD network is only as strong as when you're staring at a black screen. Same thing in the right hemisphere, responses to tasks versus no tasks, and you get this difference. In the core language network, you get strong responses when you perform a task, and also strong responses when you don't perform a task. So regardless of whether you're doing a task or not, you have sentences coming in or lists of words, you respond strongly. So we think that 20 years of fMRI work that finds MD engagement in comprehension is all artifacts from task demands. So it's all because those studies turned natural language into problem solving, into an IQ test. And then, of course, you need fluid intelligence and you need the MD network. So my conclusion from this, at least at this point in this program of research, is that executive function mechanisms, at least to the extent that they are implemented in the MD network, don't support core linguistic computations. Executive functions don't participate in language comprehension. Does that mean that there is no role for things like working memory and inhibition and prediction in language? No, there is a major role. All of our psycholinguistic theories talk about them. But I think the right way to think about them is as canonical computations that are implemented in many domain-specific regions. So you can see the same kind of computation, prediction or working memory operations, but it's implemented in specific regions that do specific things. So I would expect that in the visual cortex, you would have the implementation of prediction for vision or working memory for vision. And in our case, in core language regions, you see the implementation of prediction in language and working memory in language and so on. What I think the multiple demand network is doing is it solves problems for which we don't have a dedicated system or we don't have learned skills or habits. Another way to think about it, maybe, and this is kind of hand-wavy, is that it's evolution's way of freeing us from evolution and freeing us from specialization. So some knowledge about the world and some cognitive abilities are innate, right? Evolution gave them to us specified in our genes. And moreover, some cognitive abilities that are very specialized and dedicated, we can learn them through exposure. But there are many things that we don't have specialized dedicated systems for. And evolution gave us this domain general network to say, whatever it is I haven't prepared you for, and whatever it is you didn't already develop a dedicated system, here, take these regions of fluid intelligence to solve whatever it is the world is throwing at you. So this is in contrast to specialized systems like the systems for face processing or theory of mind and social cognition or language. And the problem is that experimental tasks effectively turn language into an IQ test. Now, I make this big thing about language's problem solving and how that's problematic. Maybe there are cases in the real world where language is problem solving in the wild. And maybe in those cases, MD regions and executive functions are important. And so maybe when you comprehend noisy input, so when you mishear what someone is saying, or when people misspeak, or when you hear accents that you're not familiar with, right, that kind of feels like language turns into a non-natural problem-solving thing. So we're looking at this now. Maybe when you process languages in which your proficiency is not native-like, whatever native means, it's a very problematic word. Maybe during production. So I was only talking about comprehending things, but producing language is much harder, because when you're comprehending, even if you get some bag of words or you don't get exactly the particular structure of the sentence, most of the time, based on common sense, you can figure out what was said. When you produce things, you have to put words in a linear order. But there is some preliminary evidence that MD regions also don't engage in production. But maybe in turn taking, when you converse with someone and you have to figure out when they're going to stop talking and you need to start talking, maybe they'll do something there. We have some evidence that they participate in aphasia, right? So after a stroke, you lose your language abilities, or you lose some of them, you lose some of your language processing mechanisms. So language does turn to problem solving, and MD regions come to the rescue. Maybe in older adults, maybe in children. We don't know. I think these are all very exciting avenues for research. So I'll finish here. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Thanks a lot, Idan. That's a very stimulating talk. And I'm sure that there will be some questions amongst us. Beck is fortunate in that we do have such a wide group of widely interested people here. So this is our chance to, as people in the Beck sphere, be broadening our horizons as well to your fascinating work that you're doing in your cognitive psychology. So
by the way, I'm going to stop screen sharing just so that I can see people.
Sure. Yeah.
All right.
So I do see a hand up here from Clark. Clark, why don't you kick things off, if you would?
Sure. Thank you for a great talk. I actually have multiple questions, but I'll try to pick a couple of them, or at least one to start with. I was interested that in your idea of canonical computations, that there might be some kinds of computations that are found across the brain, maybe similar to how the Krebs cycle occurs in every cell of our body or something like that, right? I guess I have an empirical question for you then, because you often see in psychology and in neuroscience certain kinds of computational signatures being taken as evidence for a domain general process. I mean, if I take you correctly, there's a sense in which to call like a predictive process in vision domain general might be incorrect if it's actually handled by a separate system in vision than it's handled in language, right? So then I wonder, does that lead to this problem where the kinds of evidence that people take for things like signatures of statistical learning across different domains, or evidence of Bayesian updating across multiple domains, those, if I'm not mistaken, are often taken as signatures for domain general processes that cross those domains. But canonical computations would suggest maybe that's a mistake. What do you think about that?
I agree. And it took me a long while to come to that conclusion, because I used to take those studies as evidence for a shared common domain general resource. And if you look at even psycholinguistic studies, like the most highly cited studies, for example, that talk about prediction, in between the lines, they just sort of assume it's a domain general resource, because why not? And that's why we did this study about prediction, and then we saw it is not. So I definitely think you need more evidence. So for example, you want to see whether individual differences co-vary, right? Whether people who are better at visual prediction are also good at linguistic prediction. That would be slightly more convincing that maybe they draw on some shared mechanism, right? If you see patients that have one of these impaired but not the others, that would definitely mean these things are not one and the same, right? Or at least there are parts of them that are sufficient to carry one without the other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that just finding the same process across domains doesn't mean that it's a shared resource. And it kind of makes sense, right? Evolution, again, this is kind of in quotes, but it likes to copy and paste, right? If you figured out a process that works really well in one domain, you might as well use it in another domain as well, right? All of our neurons at some level are the same across these very different specialized systems, right? They all do integrate and fire. They all have the same structure. Makes sense that they sort of implement very similar computations, but just on different inputs and different kinds of representations.
Makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, the next question that I saw was from Emmy.
Hi, actually, I too had a couple questions, but maybe I can. That's a very interesting talk. And one thing I'm wondering about is, can you remind us, or at least me, how you determined the multiple domain areas? Because I know you showed up something with blocks where you were supposed to remember where certain blocks were or something. And I'm just wondering, were a variety of tasks used to determine multiple domain areas, or is it possible that some of those tasks may themselves be specific to a domain other than language?
That's a great question. So in some studies, we use that one task of that working memory, spatial working memory game with the squares. In other tasks, we look for regions that respond more to gibberish than to the sentences, so the opposite response profile of the language network. It turns out that this gives you the same regions. There are a few studies where we use both. So we try to find regions with one, then we try to find regions with others. With the other task, we find the same signatures. And there are a lot of, I think, a decade of work that validates that spatial working memory game is a good localizer for the MD network. So for example, if you use that task to find those regions, and once you found those regions, you ask, okay, do they respond more to hard than easy math? Do they respond more to inhibition versus no inhibition? They show all of those signatures. And so you can take any of those other tasks and you find basically the same regions. And so this is just the one that we picked up and that we have the most data of. Other labs use other tasks, and that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
The next question I saw from Jeff.
Great, thank you, and great talk. My comment and question is probably very similar to Emmy and Clark, which is how much of this is a function of specialization versus expertise. And I'm wondering if you've tested like early adolescence, so pre-language acquisition versus post, and even expertise. So something like facial recognition, before you have facial expertise or some other expertise, and whether you see differences in MD performance, pre and post expertise.
That's a great question. We haven't. There is a lot of studies, even in monkeys, that shows that when you learn a new artificial task, representations in the multiple domain network or in regions that in monkeys seem to be homologs of what it is in our brain, that is called a multiple domain network, those change to encode the relevant rule for the task. And when you switch the rule midway through a task, those representations start switching to represent the rule. We haven't looked at it in kids. It's very hard with language acquisition, right? Because you want to go really, really early on the one hand. And it's just hard doing experiments on those kids, but I hope to collaborate with people who are very smart and figured out how to scan infants and get good data. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there is some evidence that our language learning abilities have a very sharp drop around the age of 18 to 20. So that might even suggest that maybe we can look for differences between like 10-year-olds and 40-year-olds, which we haven't done yet, given that there is some change.
And possibly second language as well, if you do that sort of pre that age.
So I really want to get UCLA students who are taking a language class and scan them like at the beginning of the quarter and the end of the quarter, and maybe hopefully they take language classes for more than one quarter. I think would get MD regions there because it certainly feels like problem solving, but I really don't know. You can also imagine other patterns. So for example, you could imagine that some people have just a natural talent for, or a natural tendency to pick up languages quickly, right? And so in those people might not need the MD regions, right? So you might expect that people who engage their MD regions more actually do worse in learning a language because you engage a system that was not designed to support those kinds of computations. So that's a possible finding too. I don't know. I'm really curious to see what will happen there. And it's very possible. It's very possible that the MD network supports the very first stages of wiring up the language network, right? The very first stages of acquisition. It doesn't seem to be the case just because the developmental trajectories of executive functions and language are not aligned. But I don't think that that's evidence enough to sort of refute that view. So that's possible. And about expertise versus, I mean, there's a lot of learning that has to happen in the language network, right? So the most basic thing is you don't know which languages you're going to be exposed to. So most of your knowledge of the sounds of your language and which words correspond to which meaning, that has to be expertise that is being acquired, right? And expertise can also lead to specialization. So for example, we have a region in our visual cortex that only responds to letters and only letters that we know how to read. That has to be through learning, right? That can't be innate. And so one thing that confuses some people, especially people who are very against innateness, is when I show them that there is a specialized system for language, they think I claim that it's innate. And that's not the claim. You can get a specialized system through training.
That makes sense. Thank you.
There's also a question from Martin.
I was thinking of something in the same area. Is there any research looking at bilinguals and comparing their natal language and their early acquired language in terms of their brain's ability to comprehend sentences and gibberish and other things that you're studying?
There is. I'm not an expert on that work, even though I should be. One reason that I just stepped aside from that work is that a lot of that work is related to what's called the bilingual advantage, which was an idea from, I don't know, the 80s, that being bilingual increases your fluid intelligence. And that whole literature has major problems with replicability, and it's still very hotly debated. And some people believe it's completely been refuted, and some people believe it really hasn't. So I just tried to sidestep that discussion. I will mention one study that we did that doesn't address your question, but I think it's sort of tangentially related and interesting. We looked at polyglots, so people who speak 5 or more languages, including people who speak 55 languages. Their language regions, so their MD regions are not different from in their response profiles, at least the basic response profiles. They're not bigger, they don't respond more strongly. Their language regions are smaller than the extent of activation is weaker than you see in people who speak just one language. And that one way, sort of a post hoc story to interpret that, is that sort of goes with the neural efficiency account, right? That if a system is very, very computationally efficient, you don't need a lot of neurons for it. And so maybe those people either developmentally or genetically have a very efficient language system, and it's smaller, and that's why they're very good at picking up languages. But it was one study, it's very early days, but at least in that case of an increased ability to acquire more languages, we don't see differences in MD regions. We see differences in language regions.
All right, Clark, I saw your hand go up, but if I might just poach this one spot in the queue. I was wondering if you've run, or other folks who are working in this area have run tasks that try to mimic when you mentioned as a response to Emmy's question about how you defined the MD areas, you mentioned spatial working memory as being one of the tasks that might be used to define that. I was wondering if you were to run a task in which the story itself that you're conveying to individuals has a strong spatialized component where you're having to track locations in space. Have any of those kinds of tasks been administered to see if you can really force the MD networks to make an appearance in a way that would be closely analogous to a visual working memory test, or if that sort of works?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if anyone who's tried that.
Yeah.
My prediction would be that I think that kind of tracking of location is not exactly the same as the tracking of the squares in the space, because something about those squares appearing on the grid is very unnatural, right? You don't often do that in the real world. Whereas remembering actual meaningful locations and the order in which they were visited and the people associated with them is something important. And we have a system for navigation in the brain, another specialized system for spatial navigation and recognizing landmarks. And I would expect that if anything outside the language network is active when you have this story that describes locations and you have to keep them in mind, it would be that network that tracks those things. There's yet another network that's called, people call it the default mode. I don't like that name. I call it the episodic network. It seems very engaged in retrospection and prospection and generally building narratives. So the language network doesn't seem to care about much above the sentence level. Sort of the sentence is kind of the unit that it cares about, 10 words more or less. This other network really cares about narratives and integrating across sentences. And so if you hear a story about people visiting or yourself going to different locations and going back and something like that, I would expect that that network would be very important for integrating that narrative and constructing that schema or that mental map of that narrative. So one of those two networks I would expect to see rather than the MD, but it's an empirical question. We haven't tried that. I'm not sure if spatial thing would be, because it's not that the MD network is special, there's anything special about space for that network. We similarly do a verbal working memory where you show people the word 2, 3, 5, 8, and then you show them the digits 2, 3, 5, 8 or 2, 3, 8, 5, and they need to tell, and again, the MD network really cares about that. The language network, even though those are words, doesn't care about that task at all.
Great. Well,
so,
thanks for even being bold enough to make that prediction. That's really healthy. So Clark, Greg.
Greg should go first because I already asked a question.
All right, Greg.
Okay, thanks, Clark. Hi, thanks for your talk. My question is, I really like the in the wild approach, and I've argued for this in my own domain of work, that it's really important. And so I just want to push you on this a little bit. And so some people might argue that you're not really engaging true language functions until you've looked at them while people are engaged in discourse, which is a multimodal affair where you're seeing faces and you're hearing voices and there's contextual understanding and all these variables. Now I know you can't do that in fMRI, but I'm just wondering if like to what extent, how important do you think that is for understanding the system that you're describing here? And then two, what kinds of ideas do you have for how to overcome that problem? So it's obviously a huge problem, so you have to be creative, right?
I think it's crucial because, you know, I call it language in the wild. It's still pretty isolated. It's listening to stories, which is one thing we do in the wild, but most of the language we do in the wild is not, well, I don't know, if you watch a Netflix show, it's kind of similar. You could show people movies. That's definitely something that people are doing. It's a little harder to isolate language. One thing is that the fact that the language system is specialized doesn't mean that it doesn't communicate with other systems, right? It has to. It has to integrate information from the visual context, from the social context, from everything else. So for example, we do have evidence that the language network and the network for theory of mind or social cognition are slightly synchronized with one another. There is something, maybe communication happening between them. And it might be that synchronization would get much, much stronger when you get to things that are even more naturalistic. So we tried making small steps. So for example, we have people listening to dialogue versus then a story, where you have to track multiple mental states of multiple speakers and intentions and stuff like that. The data so far seem overall consistent with what we've seen up to now, but again, not a lot of those analyses focus on the theory of mind network and not on the MD network. Other things that we haven't done, but people are doing is hyperscanning, where you scan two people simultaneously. If you have two scanners and you can connect them and they can talk to one another. The problem there is that speech, like head movement, destroys fMRI data. And so either you need to train people to somehow speak without moving, or you need to devise keyboards that are compatible with the huge magnet and have people do kind of chatting, which I don't know if anyone tried, but I know those keyboards exist. So that's another thing you could do. And you know, you can also use systems that that can be sort of wearable in the real world, or at least in a room, right? So you can have an EEG cap on multiple people and have them walk around and talk. The problem there is that with EEG, you can't localize where your signals are coming from because it's all on the scalp. So you can't tell whether you're looking at MD or language. There has been some claims in other domains, and I want to look into them, that you can train a machine learning algorithm. So you scan some people with fMRI and EEG, and then you train a machine learning algorithm to tell you from the EEG which signals come from the language system in fMRI. And then on new people, you can just scan them on EEG and figure out what comes from the MD or language system. I haven't tried it. I don't know how strong or robust these methods are. There is someone at UCLA who has, not in psychology, who has patients with implanted electrodes into their brains for, I think it's for epilepsy therapy. And so there you get recordings from electrodes, millisecond timescale, and they just walk around in the world. And so she's mostly testing things like navigation for now. But you could imagine that if those electrodes happen to be implanted in MD regions and or in language regions, you could then have them in a room converse with someone and get the data. Hopefully we'll get there someday, but not quite there yet.
Thank you.
Clark, we do have, we're at 1:30, but I think this is a great opportunity to have this a chance to chat with Idan. So do you want to ask your follow-up?
Yeah, I know we're near the end of time of our time. So yeah, I guess probably too long of a question to answer in the remaining time, but I was really intrigued by some of the things that you had said for the earlier questions. And I just kind of wanted to circle back around to asking, you know, it seems to me, and I'm giving away a little bit of my theoretical predilections here, but that, you know, you identified in your talk one of these sort of mysterious things about domain general or executive processes, right? That they're sort of evoked as this catch-all category. And I feel like there's almost a circularity when people say, the purpose of these parts of the brain is that they evolved to take care of things for which there was nothing in evolution to take care of them already. There seems to be a strange, and so, and I feel like sometimes people invoke them to explain too many things, given that we don't seem to really understand. There's not necessarily a good theory, but therefore. And so I was really compelled by your data that suggests, if I take you correctly, that when you really look at the language system, it does handle almost everything that you would expect such a system to handle. And there's not much left over for the MD system. You showed us a bunch of data like that. So I guess my question is, and this is not an easy one, but, you know, do we really know, I mean, do we really know what the MD system is? It seems like it's underdescribed compared to these other systems, and yet people invoke these kinds of mechanisms to explain a lot of cognition. And it seems to me that there's something there that doesn't fit. And I'm wondering what your thought on that is. I realize it's a very open-ended question.
I think I'll try to do this briefly, which is not something I'm good at. I think there is a lot of progress to be made there. I don't know what that system is doing, but I think there are very interesting suggestions and people that are trying to pursue computationally more explicit explanations. So for example, John Duncan claims that fluid intelligence is the ability to break a task into subtasks and trying to test whether that kind of ability relates to what the MD system is doing, this sort of fractionate your planning in a meaningful way. Work in monkeys suggests that what their homolog system might be doing is bias representations in those other specialized systems based on the current task, right? So in the domain of vision, if I need to find a shape that's different in color, or find an image that's different in color versus find an image that's different in shape, I need to emphasize different aspects of my visual representation. And one idea is that the MD system that's connected to all of these other systems gives the signals to emphasize activity in some parts and maybe decrease activity in other parts, so that you sort of stretch dimensions of the space and shrink dimensions of the space in it based on your current goals. So that's another idea, that it's a little more computationally explicit, and that there are others as well. So I think people are trying to make sense of this system, but we're still not there.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Idan. I just thought we could all thank you again for your time, and it was wonderful to welcome you to Beck, and hopefully
Thank you
this
for
will be,
having me.
fostering a lot of more connections between different parts of our universe and university. So thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you all.
And you can just, you're a co-host, so I'm going to pause the recording now, and we
right.
can all go about our Mondays, and look forward to being in touch with you again soon. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the talk.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions.
Okay. See you soon.
See ya.